The funeral felt colder than the October rain. The air carried the weight of whispers and polite grief, yet Richard Caldwell stood motionless, his expression carved in stone. To everyone gathered, he was the portrait of mourning, a devoted husband saying goodbye to the woman who had stood by him through wealth, illness, and time. But beneath the surface, guilt and memory pressed like thorns against his heart. He didn't cry. He couldn't. His eyes kept drifting toward the back of the crowd, where a lone woman stood apart, her black coat blending into the mist. Elena Price. She wasn't family. She wasn't a friend. Most of those who noticed her assumed she was an acquaintance of the deceased. Richard knew better. Her presence felt like both a punishment and a reminder of everything he'd tried to bury. When the priest finished his prayer, Richard's hand trembled as he dropped a single white rose into the grave. A memory flickered, a hotel balcony in Paris, sunlight on Elena's face, the way she had laughed and said she wished she could be invisible. Now she almost was. Their eyes met briefly before she turned away. For the first time that day, Richard's composure cracked. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was polite but tense. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter rang too loudly, and everyone spoke as though the dead could hear. Nathan, Richard's son, accepted condolences with practiced charm, but his sharp gaze didn't miss much. He caught sight of Elena near the entrance, speaking quietly to the butler as if she already knew the layout of the house. He frowned. "Who is that woman?" he asked Helen Moore, his mother's oldest friend. Helen pursed her lips, leaning closer. "I don't know, but she looks familiar." As guests drifted through rooms filled with flowers and silent portraits, Richard retreated to his study. He had promised himself he wouldn't think of her again, yet his thoughts betrayed him. The way Elena had avoided his gaze all afternoon meant she still carried shame, or perhaps pain. He wondered which of the two hurt more. When Nathan entered unannounced, Richard quickly composed himself. "You okay, Dad?" Nathan asked. "You look distracted." Richard managed a tired smile. "Just tired, son. Your mother would have hated all this fuss." Nathan nodded, though he didn't believe him. His father's voice had always been steady, commanding, but now there was a fracture, a tremor Nathan couldn't name. Later that evening, as the house emptied and the rain began again, Richard stood by the window, staring into the darkness. He thought about the woman at the funeral. He thought about the way his late wife's eyes used to follow him when he came home late, how she never asked where he'd been, how silence had become their language. Guilt sat heavy in his chest. He poured himself a drink, but it didn't help. It never did. In another part of town, Elena sat in her small apartment, her clothes still damp from the rain. The funeral replayed in her mind, the coffin, the murmured prayers, the way Richard's face had hardened when he saw her. She hadn't planned to attend. She had promised herself she wouldn't. But when she read the obituary, something in her refused to stay away. Margaret Caldwell had been kind, even when she didn't have to be. Elena remembered the last time they met, a hospital hallway, a brief conversation that still haunted her. "Take care of him when I'm gone," Margaret had whispered. At the time, Elena thought it was just a kindness born of exhaustion. Now it felt like a command she could never obey. The mansion grew quieter as midnight approached. The servants had gone, and Nathan was asleep in the guest wing. Richard moved through the study, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor. He opened a locked drawer, the one Margaret had never touched. Inside lay a stack of old photographs, a few letters, and one picture he had never been able to throw away. Elena, standing by the Seine, smiling at him through the lens. Paris, 2019. They had been reckless then, alive in a way he hadn't felt in decades. The memory hurt now. He traced her outline with his thumb before closing the drawer again, but not before whispering her name under his breath. Elena. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The rain tapped against the windows like quiet knocking. Richard poured another drink and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He told himself it was over, that love like theirs couldn't survive reality. But as the wind howled through the empty halls, he could still hear her laugh, still feel the warmth of her hand in his. In the morning, Nathan found his father asleep in the study, the glass still half full. The storm had passed, but the air in the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets. Nathan noticed the open drawer, but said nothing. He had learned long ago that his father's silences often hid more than his words. Somewhere far away, Elena woke to a gray dawn and the echo of church bells. She tried to convince herself that attending the funeral had been closure, but the hollow ache in her chest said otherwise. She knew she couldn't avoid him forever. She had a promise to keep, a truth to face, and perhaps one more goodbye left to give. Back at the Caldwell estate, Richard stood at the balcony, watching the mist lift from the gardens. The mansion looked exactly as it always had, elegant, orderly, lifeless. Yet something had changed. The past was no longer content to stay buried. He felt it stirring like a ghost, whispering in the corners of his memory, reminding him that some debts of the heart are never paid in full. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence, knowing that before long, it would be broken. A week after the funeral, the mansion felt emptier than ever. The staff moved quietly, as if sound itself would disturb the weight of grief that hung over the house. Richard spent his days in his study, pretending to read while replaying memories he couldn't escape. Each night, he walked the halls alone, passing the rooms Margaret once filled with life, until one morning a soft knock broke the silence. When he opened the door, she was standing there, Elena. Her black coat dripped with rain, her expression calm but fragile. "Margaret asked me to visit if anything ever happened to her," she said simply. Richard couldn't speak. He just stepped aside. For days afterward, her presence stirred the air like a memory come alive. She moved through the house, as though she already knew its corners. She said she came to organize Margaret's art collection, to help catalog the pieces for the foundation, but everyone knew it was more complicated than that. Nathan watched her closely, suspicion clear in his eyes. To him, she was the woman who shouldn't be here, the one who had turned his father's grief into confusion. But Richard couldn't send her away. He told himself it was for Margaret's sake, but deep down he knew it was because of what they once were. 5 years earlier, in a ballroom filled with chandeliers and champagne, they had met by accident. Richard had been attending a charity gala, another polished event meant to make the wealthy feel generous. Elena was the curator, explaining the auction pieces with quiet passion. She spoke about art the way some people spoke about faith, with belief, not performance. Richard had been captivated. That night, their conversation lasted hours. What began as curiosity became an escape from everything Richard's life had turned into: endless business meetings, a marriage held together by habit, and the slow decay of something once beautiful. Elena was warmth where everything else felt cold. Their affair began cautiously, with letters and late-night calls. Richard told himself he was helping her career, sponsoring exhibitions, introducing her to investors. But affection crept in, subtle at first, then consuming. He loved the way she made him feel seen again, the way she never looked at him like a man defined by money. When they traveled together, he felt young again, alive. Yet guilt followed him like a shadow. He always returned home to Margaret, who never asked questions. She must have known, he thought, but she never said a word. Her silence was mercy and punishment all at once. When Margaret fell ill, Richard tried to end things with Elena. He told her it wasn't fair, that his wife needed him now. Elena understood, though her voice trembled when she said goodbye. "You'll come back," she had whispered, not as a hope, but as a truth she didn't want to admit. For months after, they didn't speak. Then, one afternoon, Elena received a letter, not from Richard, but from Margaret. It was brief, almost clinical, thanking her for her help at a previous charity and asking to meet privately. Elena hesitated, but agreed. When they met, Margaret looked frail, but composed. There was no anger, no accusation. "He loves you," she said quietly, "and I forgive you both." Elena didn't know how to respond. Margaret reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly. "When I'm gone, promise me you'll make sure he isn't alone. He won't know how to live without someone to take care of him." Those words replayed in Elena's mind now as she unpacked boxes in the guest house. She told herself she was only fulfilling a promise, but the old ache returned each time Richard entered the room. He tried to maintain distance, but the air between them pulsed with what they didn't say. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, he found her in the study, holding one of Margaret's paintings, a portrait of the sea, calm but endless. She wanted this room finished before she passed, Elena said softly. She said it reminded her of hope. Richard stared at the painting, his voice quiet. Margaret always believed in beauty, even when she stopped believing in me. Nathan entered unexpectedly, his tone sharp. So this is what we're doing now. Letting strangers live here? Richard stiffened. She's helping with your mother's estate. Nathan's eyes narrowed.
Right.
Helping. That what you're calling it? Elena said nothing, lowering her gaze. Richard's patience cracked. Enough, Nathan. You don't understand. No, Nathan shot back. I understand perfectly. He stormed out, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Later that night, Richard sat by the fire, unable to shake his son's words. He wasn't angry, only ashamed. He knew what the world would think, what they already whispered, that the millionaire couldn't wait to replace his wife. But it wasn't like that. This wasn't about desire anymore. It was something deeper, messier, bound by love and regret. Elena joined him, her expression uncertain. I shouldn't have come, she murmured. It's not right. Richard shook his head.
No.
You came because she wanted you to. Maybe she knew we'd both need forgiveness. The nights grew longer, filled with silence that wasn't empty but charged. Sometimes they talked about Margaret, her kindness, her quiet strength. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. The line between grief and affection blurred until neither of them could tell the difference. Still, both avoided what they wanted to say. Neither had the courage to admit that love hadn't died, only changed shape. By the second week, the house began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like something alive again. Flowers returned to the vases, sunlight reached the curtains. But beneath it all, unease lingered. The staff whispered, the neighbors speculated, and Nathan watched with silent judgment. Richard tried to ignore it, but he knew what it looked like, a widower too close to the woman everyone suspected had once been his mistress. He wondered what Margaret would think, if she'd truly wanted this, or if her forgiveness had been a quiet test he was now failing. One night, unable to sleep, he found himself outside Elena's door. He didn't knock. He just stood there, listening to the faint hum of her voice from within, as if she were talking to someone unseen. He turned away before she could notice him, whispering to himself, I'm sorry, Margaret. The rain began to fall again, soft and relentless, like confession. In her room, Elena sat by the window, clutching Margaret's old letter. The ink had faded slightly, but one line still burned in her mind. Take care of him, but never lose yourself in his sorrow. She had promised, and she intended to keep it. But even promises, she realized, had a cost. In the quiet hours before dawn, the mansion slept, unaware of what was coming. The house held more than grief now. It held questions, buried truths, and love that refused to die, no matter how wrong it had been. And in the middle of it all, two people bound by guilt and tenderness waited for the past to finish unraveling. The morning of the will reading arrived with a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the air itself knew something irreversible was about to happen. The family lawyer, an old man with a tired voice, sat at the long oak table. Richard took his place at the head, his face drawn and pale. Nathan sat across from him, tense, eyes sharp with suspicion. Elena stood near the doorway, clearly uncomfortable but refusing to leave. She had been asked to stay, though she didn't know why. When the lawyer began, his words carried the dry tone of procedure until he reached the final clause. The estate, Margaret's wealth, her shares in the company, her private collection, all were to be transferred to a single trustee, Elena Price. The silence that followed felt like thunder trapped in the walls. Nathan's chair scraped violently against the floor. You can't be serious, he snapped. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. It's all in her handwriting. Witnessed, notarized, legally binding. Richard looked at Elena, his mind refusing to accept what his ears had heard. Margaret left everything to her, he said, his voice cracking. Elena shook her head in disbelief. No, that's impossible. She couldn't have. Nathan turned on her. You think we're stupid? You wormed your way in years ago, and now you've taken everything. My mother isn't even cold, and you're already cashing in. Richard slammed his hand against the table. Enough. His voice was louder than he intended, but even he could feel it. Anger, confusion, shame. The lawyer hesitated before speaking again. There's one more thing, Mr. Caldwell. A personal letter addressed to you. Mrs. Caldwell instructed that it be read privately. He handed over an envelope sealed in blue wax. Richard took it with trembling hands. His name was written in Margaret's graceful cursive. For a moment, he couldn't open it. He left the room, retreating to his study as the tension behind him crackled like static. Elena followed, ignoring Nathan's glare. She stood silently as Richard broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable. My dear Richard, it began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. Please don't grieve for too long. I had a full life, even with the things we never said to each other. I know about her. I have for years. You never confessed, but I saw the way you looked at her. I understood more than you think. I wanted to hate you both, but I couldn't, because before you loved her, I knew her too. Richard stopped reading, his pulse roaring in his ears. He read on, the words slicing through him like glass. Elena Price. You met her at a gala. I met her long before that. She was born in 1991 in a small hospital in Hartford. I was there. She was mine. The world tilted. The room seemed to shrink. Margaret's letter continued, each sentence worse than the last. When I was young, I made a mistake, a child I couldn't keep. My parents sent her away, told me to forget. I never did. Years later, I searched for her. I found her, but I couldn't tell you. I was ashamed. When you brought her into our lives, I thought fate was punishing me or maybe giving me a second chance. She didn't know, Richard. Neither did you. Please don't blame her. Don't blame yourself. This was my secret, not yours. Richard's hand trembled as he reached the final lines. By the time you read this, she will have everything I owned. Not because she took it, but because I wanted her to have what was always hers. My daughter deserves a life free of shame. And you deserve peace. Forgive me for the years of silence. I loved you both, even if in ways that broke me. He couldn't breathe. The paper fell from his hands. Elena stepped forward, eyes wide, face pale. What does it say? She whispered. He looked at her, this woman he had loved, desired, trusted, and the words died in his throat. It says you're her daughter, he managed, barely audible. For a second, she didn't move. Then she shook her head, laughing once in disbelief. That's not possible. That can't be real. He showed her the letter. She read it, her expression shifting from confusion to horror. The room filled with a silence that felt alive. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. No. She must have been wrong. Nathan burst into the study then, demanding answers, but one look at their faces silenced him. What the hell is going on? He asked. Richard couldn't answer. Elena turned away, gripping the edge of the desk like it was the only thing keeping her upright. You are my father's wife, she said to the empty air, as if speaking to Margaret's ghost. You knew. You forgave him because you knew. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice hardened. She let us live in sin. She let this happen. Richard tried to reach for her, but she flinched. Don't, she said sharply. Don't touch me. Nathan stood frozen, his earlier anger replaced by horror. Dad, what did you do? Richard's voice cracked when he spoke. I didn't know. God help me, I didn't know. He sat down, covering his face. The letter lay open on the desk, the ink smudged by tears. Elena turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she looked back at him. I thought she wanted me to take care of you, she said quietly. But she just wanted me to find out who I was. And now I wish I hadn't. She walked out into the rain, her footsteps fading. Richard didn't follow. He couldn't. The weight of what he'd done unknowingly, impossibly, crushed him. Nathan picked up the letter, scanning the words, his expression hollow. "You loved her," he said, disbelief in his tone. "And she's my sister." Richard said nothing. He stared at the fireplace, the flames flickering weakly, the sound of rain filling the silence. That night, the mansion felt colder than it ever had before. Every room seemed haunted by voices, Margaret's calm forgiveness, Elena's broken sobs, his own silent guilt. He poured himself a drink and let the glass slip from his hand. It shattered across the floor, fragments scattering like the life he thought he understood. The will had taken everything from him, his wealth, his reputation, his son's respect, but the truth had taken something far worse. Upstairs, Nathan packed his bags without a word. He didn't look at his father when he passed the study. The only sound was the front door closing behind him. Richard sat alone, surrounded by the ghosts of his choices. The storm outside grew louder, shaking the windows. He whispered Margaret's name once, then Elena's, as if saying them together could make sense of any of it. But nothing did. The letter lay open on the desk, the ink bleeding slowly into the paper, like secrets too heavy to stay hidden. The days after the revelation passed in a haze of silence. The mansion, once filled with movement and echo, had become a hollow monument to everything Richard had lost. Nathan had left without goodbye, and Elena had disappeared, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and the memory of the letter that had destroyed them both. Richard tried to fill the hours with routine, breakfast he didn't eat, walks through the garden he didn't see, but his world had gone colorless. Every portrait, every object Margaret once touched, carried weight. Even the quiet seemed to accuse him. He had loved two women and betrayed them both without ever meaning to. The press eventually found out. Whispers turned into headlines, and soon the Caldwell name became a spectacle. Millionaire's mistress inherits fortune. One read. Affair ends in scandalous twist. Another. Richard stopped reading after that. He withdrew completely, shutting himself away in the study where Margaret's letter still lay on the desk. He couldn't burn it, though he had thought about it many times. It was the only thing left of her, the last piece of her voice. He read it again and again, not searching for forgiveness anymore, but for understanding. Margaret hadn't written in anger. Her words were full of sorrow, not vengeance. She had left him with truth, believing it would set him free. Instead, it chained him to guilt he would never escape. Weeks turned to months. One morning, a letter arrived addressed in a familiar hand, Elena's. He hesitated before opening it, heart pounding. The words were calm, deliberate, like someone who had finally stopped running. Richard, she wrote, I needed time to understand what happened to us, what we were, what we can never be. I don't blame you. Neither of us knew the truth. I've spent my life searching for where I belong, and now I have to face what that really means. I forgive Margaret for her silence, and I forgive you for your love. But I can't come back. Not here. Not to this house. Not to the life that was built on lies neither of us told. Please don't look for me. Live quietly. Remember her kindly. He folded the letter carefully, his eyes wet though he didn't cry. Forgiveness felt heavier than punishment. He had expected anger, but instead, she'd given him something worse, peace he didn't deserve. That night, he stood in front of the window, the lights of the city flickering in the distance, and he realized the mansion had become a tomb not of death, but of secrets. Margaret's presence lingered in every corner, not as a ghost, but as a reminder that love, when mishandled, leaves nothing but echoes. Nathan returned once, months later. His face had hardened, but the bitterness in his eyes had cooled into pity. He said he'd come for business, paperwork about the foundation Richard had begun in Margaret's and Elena's names. The Caldwell Foundation for Women in Art had quickly grown, quietly funding young artists who couldn't afford to dream otherwise. It was the only thing Richard had done that made sense anymore. Nathan stood in the doorway, hesitating. Mom would have liked this, he said softly. She would have liked that something good came from all of it. Richard nodded. She always believed good could survive anything. Nathan's gaze softened slightly before he turned to leave. Take care of yourself, Dad. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't hate either. It was something in between, an open door, faint but real. As the years passed, Richard withdrew further from the world. He sold most of his business holdings, donated the mansion to the foundation, and moved into a small house by the coast where no one knew his name. He spent his mornings walking along the water, his evenings reading letters he no longer had the courage to answer. Time softened some of the pain, but not the memory. He often thought of Margaret's kindness, her quiet understanding, and how she had chosen to forgive instead of destroy. He thought of Elena too, not as the woman he once loved, but as the person who had taught him what love could cost. In his solitude, he realized that both women had saved him, just not in the way he had wanted. On the anniversary of Margaret's death, he visited her grave for the first time in years. The cemetery was quiet, the air heavy with salt from the sea. Someone had already been there. A single white lily rested against the headstone. He knew instantly who had left it. Elena. He didn't try to find her. He didn't need to. Some connections, he had learned, don't fade. They just exist quietly, beneath the surface, like roots that hold even after the tree is gone. He stood there for a long while, tracing her name on the stone, whispering words no one else could hear. When he returned home, the evening light poured through the windows like gold. On his desk sat a framed photograph Margaret had taken years ago, their honeymoon in Italy, both of them young and unguarded. Beside it lay a copy of the Foundation's annual report. The front page showed a group of smiling women, artists whose lives had changed because of his donations. At the bottom of the letterhead, he noticed a small signature, E. Price, Director of Curation. His chest tightened. She had found her way back, not to him, but to what mattered. And maybe that was enough. That night, he sat by the fireplace, the house quiet except for the soft crackle of flames. He wrote one last letter, not to send but to leave behind. Margaret, he began, you were right. The truth set us free, just not in the way we imagined. I lost you, I lost her, but I found something I can live with. Understanding. I hope wherever you are, you know that I loved you until the end. And I hope she knows that love doesn't always need to survive to mean something. He signed it simply, Richard, and placed it beside the photograph. The firelight flickered over the desk, dancing across the faces in the picture. Outside, the ocean murmured softly against the rocks, steady and unending. In the morning, a caretaker found the room empty, the fireplace still warm, the letter untouched. The house stood silent again, filled with ghosts that no longer haunted but watched. On the desk, the photograph and letter remained side by side, beneath a final inscription he had carved into the wood before he left. Some loves are meant to save us, even when they destroy us first.